The story of a superpower doesn't end in a single moment. It ends in a drift. A drift so slow that most living through it don't recognize the change until something, the lights, the rhythms, the confidence, feels slightly different than before. The old strength is still there, but in the way a fading echo is still there. Familiar, recognizable, yet so clearly belonging to another time. To understand the shift, you have to begin with longevity. No country dominates forever. No society remains the center of the world for more than a handful of centuries. Empire is not a permanent condition. It's a passing arrangement between geography, resources, culture, and luck. This particular superpower begins its drift gradually, not through defeat or collapse, but through friction. Friction inside the system, and friction against a world it no longer fully understands. In the early years, it still commands oceans, currencies, and attention. Its military, vast and sprawling, reaches across continents as easily as a hand closing around a cup. Its cultural influence is unmatched. Music, movies, companies, brands, still everywhere, still shaping what people dream of becoming. But the internal seams start to strain. Political divisions sharpen until they become less like disagreements and more like differing realities. Economic cycles grow increasingly volatile, bouncing between exuberance and quiet fear. Infrastructure, roads, ports, power grids, ages like bones under stress. And a feeling begins to spread, softly at first, that the grand promise of prosperity has narrowed into something smaller and more precarious. This is not collapse. It is entropy. States and provinces wrestle with one another. National unity becomes something spoken of with nostalgia rather than certainty. Long-term planning grows difficult when governments change direction with every election. Debt accumulates quietly in the walls. Trust between institutions and citizens drains drop by drop. The superpower is still enormous, still rich, still culturally magnetic. But something essential shifts. Its influence becomes less of a gravitational pull and more of a momentum left over from another age. Meanwhile, outside its borders, the world no longer waits. Europe moves toward closer integration, no longer content to rely on guarantees it quietly doubts will always be honored. Trade routes across Eurasia strengthen. The center of global manufacturing and digital innovation creeps westward across the Pacific. African economies accelerate with youthful populations and rapid urbanization. The hemispheres begin to develop their own gravitational fields. Allies remain allies, but they hedge, they diversify. They prepare for a world where one country no longer writes the rules by default. 70 years in, the shift is unmistakable. Not hostile, just neutral, pragmatic. Partners who once followed now negotiate. Treaties once assumed to be forever now feel conditional. The old superpower's cultural exports still shape the world, but no longer define it. Its currency remains central but no longer singular. The world does not fracture, it decenters. Instead of a single dominant actor, there are many large actors, each powerful in a different way. One controls logistics, another controls energy, another controls digital platforms, another controls raw materials. Influence becomes specialized, like organs in a body, rather than monopolized by one. By the 120-year mark, the superpower exists in a new identity. As a large nation, still wealthy, still important, yet no longer the axis around which everything turns. It becomes one of several partial hegemons, deeply influential in some domains, weaker in others. Its military is unmatched, but expensive to maintain. Its economy remains innovative, but no longer the world's primary engine. Its culture resonates, but competes with rising global storytellers. 2 centuries in, historians describe the transition not as a fall, but as a reversion to normal, a return to a world that is truly multipolar. A world where cultures rise and converge. A world where influence is distributed across continents rather than concentrated in one. The old superpower still stands tall, still respected, still consequential, still capable of enormous action and incredible creativity. But it shares the stage now. It is a giant among giants, a loud voice in a choir. The unraveling was not a tragedy. It was an evolution, slow, inevitable, and surprisingly peaceful. A shift that reminds us that the map of global influence is not a pyramid, but a tide, and all tides move. There are moments in history when the center of the world quietly shifts, not through conquest, but gravity, economic gravity, demographic gravity. The weight of people, cities, trade, ambition, and time. In this future, the shift doesn't feel like an explosion. It feels like a sunrise moving westward across a continent, lighting one region after another until an entire landmass glows with a new kind of intensity. The story begins with cities, dense, electric, restless cities, stretching along coasts, rivers, and mountain basins across Asia. Megaregions expand outward until the boundaries between them blur. What were once clusters of individual cities become continuous corridors. 50, 80, 120 million people flowing together in a web of speed, light, and commerce. Over decades, these megaregions grow not just larger but deeper. Rail networks thicken. Energy grids harmonize. Shipping ports evolve into automated Titan hubs. Digital ecosystems spread like nervous systems across borders. What was once a patchwork becomes something like a continental operating system, interlinked, self-reinforcing, and resilient. In the early years, the rest of the world barely notices. They see growth, they see manufacturing dominance, they see innovation, but they don't yet see the convergence. The way demography, infrastructure, and technology are slowly arranging themselves into a new story of power. By mid-century, the gravitational pull becomes unmistakable. Global supply chains bend toward the region like metal to a magnet. Financial centers across the world begin syncing their rhythms to the pulse of Eastern markets. Software standards, payments architecture, and digital platforms emerging from this region quietly become the default for billions. Not because of conquest, but because of convenience, because the system works, because it's fast, because it's everywhere you need to be before you even ask. And then, a deeper transformation begins. High-speed rail lines race across borders that once felt immutable. Energy supergrids glide electricity from deserts to coasts to mountain towns with barely a flicker. Autonomous cargo fleets trace precise lines from port to port, each one orchestrated by AI routing systems that learn faster than human planners ever could. The region becomes not a collection of nations, but the central nervous system of global logistics. Africa, with its expanding population and rising cities, builds its economic ascent by binding itself to this network. Latin America, once oriented heavily toward Atlantic ties, begins leaning across the Pacific. Middle Eastern economies integrate into the supply corridors, turning deserts into renewable energy superclusters humming with solar and wind. Even Europe, proud and technologically sophisticated, negotiates access with a new understanding. The story of the next 100 years will be shaped not by the capitals it once aligned with, but by the megaregions now humming across the Eastern Hemisphere. Yet this rise is not tidy. Rivalries simmer within the region. Historical tensions and border disputes flare, then cool, then flare again. But the interdependence is too deep for fragmentation. The infrastructure is too thick, too vital, too shared. Inside this new center of gravity, competition remains fierce, but it's the competition of neighbors linked by rails, grids, and markets, not enemies divided by oceans and ideology. The rivalry is internal, but the consequences are global. By the 100-year mark, the region becomes the engine of nearly every global industry: manufacturing, robotics, biotechnology, high-speed transportation, finance, media. Cultural influence surges outward. Fashion trends start here. Film studios here command massive global audiences. Virtual worlds, games, digital architecture all radiate from the Asian core with a sense of confidence once held elsewhere. By 140 to 160 years, the world reorganizes itself around this gravitational well. Trade routes reorient. Shipping patterns redraw. Investment flows arc like constellations toward the glow of the mega-regions. Even languages shift subtly as global business adapts to the linguistic rhythms of the new center. This is not a return to empire. It is not a bloc dominating the world. It is a magnetic basin, a place where growth, culture, and innovation pool together, deepening with each passing decade. And 2 centuries from now, when historians look back, they won't describe this shift as a transfer of dominance, but as a rebalancing, a return to a center of population and commerce that had, for most of human history, always been one of the most dynamic regions on Earth. The Asian core didn't conquer the world. It didn't demand allegiance. It simply became so interconnected, so essential, so irreplaceable, that the world rewrote its story around it. A multipolar world, yes, but one with a bright, unmistakable center, a core defined not by conquest, but by gravity. Every era has its organizing principle. Once, it was empire. Then it was industry. Later, it was ideology and technology. But in this future, the new axis of global power is something far older than all of them: the climate itself. It begins with a series of events no longer described as crises, but as milestones. Heat waves so intense they reshape migration, storms so large they change coastlines, droughts so persistent they redraw maps of agriculture. Each one chips away at the illusion that climate is a background condition rather than a force shaping the fate of nations. Countries react at first in familiar ways: emergency declarations, temporary rationing, frantic engineering projects. But slowly something deeper becomes apparent. No nation can fully manage the climate within its own borders. The atmosphere refuses to recognize sovereignty. Rivers do not care about treaties. Oceans move according to physics, not politics. So the world shifts. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but collectively, like a flock of birds turning in midair. Over the next 40 to 60 years, the first signs of a new kind of alliance emerge. At first, it is informal. Scientists working across borders, policymakers sharing models, engineers comparing notes on seawalls, desalination systems, and carbon capture. But as the storms grow larger and the seasons grow stranger, cooperation becomes not a choice, but a requirement. This is the beginning of the Green Alliance, a network of nations, some rich, some poor, some young, some ancient, bound not by ideology or geography, but by climate necessity. Their interests align because their vulnerabilities align. Their futures interlock because their ecosystems do. Northern nations, blessed with cooler climates and expanding agricultural zones, become havens of stability. But their advantage comes with a cost: massive waves of climate migrants seeking safety and livelihood. They cannot simply close their gates. The pressure builds too high. Equatorial nations, battered by storms and rising seas, hold enormous moral and strategic leverage. They demand support, technology transfers, debt relief, new adaptation markets. And the world learns, slowly, that these demands are not charity, but survival for all. As decades pass, the Green Alliance takes shape not as a single bloc, but as a living organism. Countries entering, leaving, negotiating, adjusting. Some contribute green technology, others provide carbon sinks in the form of vast forests or coastal ecosystems. Some offer energy, others supply minerals essential for the new renewable age. The old geopolitical currency, oil, declines. A new one takes its place. The value of a nation becomes tied to its lithium and rare earth reserves, water security, renewable energy output, agricultural resilience, carbon sequestration capacity, climate innovation ecosystem. Whoever controls these wins leverage. Whoever lacks them negotiates carefully. By the 120-year mark, the Green Alliance has grown into something more than diplomacy. It is infrastructure, shared supergrids, joint disaster response fleets, massive cross-border desalination pipelines, atmospheric monitoring swarms buzzing overhead. It is commerce, renewable exports, ecosystem services, resilient food systems co-managed by multiple nations. It is culture, a generational shift toward valuing planetary stability over endless extraction. And then comes the quiet realization. The Green Alliance is no longer green in the ideological sense. It is simply the central axis of global power. By the 180 to 200-year horizon, climate governance sits at the core of international relations. Nations negotiate access to freshwater corridors the way they once negotiated access to shipping lanes. Carbon sequestration territories are traded like strategic ports. High-latitude farmland becomes as valuable as gold mines. Atmospheric intervention, carefully monitored, tightly regulated, becomes a tool wielded by only a few trusted coalitions. Geopolitics has not vanished. It has been rewritten. The battlefield is the climate system itself. The victories are measured in degrees avoided, cities protected, harvests preserved. And in this future, the Green Alliance, imperfect, contested, always evolving, stands not as an environmental movement, but as the most strategically important institution on Earth. A reminder that power, like climate, is always shifting, and that the greatest force reshaping the world is not ideology or industry, but the planet learning to protect itself through us. If the 20th century belonged to nations and the 21st belonged to networks, then the next 2 centuries belong to something stranger. A new kind of power that doesn't rely on borders, armies, or even geography. It belongs to platforms. Not apps, not websites, not companies, but digital empires. Entities so vast, so interconnected, so deeply embedded in daily life that the old idea of national jurisdiction begins to feel thin. These platforms are not just tools. They become territories made of people, data, and decisions, layered invisibly atop every physical map. The shift begins quietly. At first, platforms simply grow more useful, managing communication, identity, payments, work, entertainment. Fragments of life that used to be scattered across dozens of institutions now converge into a few unified digital environments. People find comfort in the frictionless flow of it. One login, one wallet, one digital ID, one system that remembers everything you need before you remember it yourself. Governments, overwhelmed by complexity and speed, lean on these systems more each year. Licensing, healthcare, education, transit, food distribution and emergency alerts, energy management. Every layer of society becomes entangled with the platforms that run faster, smoother, and more consistently than any state bureaucracy ever could. But convenience has gravity, and gravity reshapes power. Within decades, these platforms negotiate directly with governments, not as corporations seeking compliance, but as sovereign actors demanding concessions. A platform might agree to provide logistics planning in exchange for regulatory freedom. Another might partner with a state to stabilize inflation by managing digital currency flows. Others might build their own arbitration courts to resolve disputes among their users. In some countries, platform rule becomes a silent foundation, unacknowledged but obvious. In others, platforms function like parallel governments, offering services faster and more efficiently than the official state. People begin to trust them more. Then something remarkable happens. Loyalty shifts. A person still holds a national passport, but they live their true daily life, identity, income, communication, community, inside a digital empire. Their sense of belonging is tied more to a platform than to the land beneath their feet. Borders blur. Jurisdictions overlap. Citizenship acquires a second layer, a digital home. By the next century, these platforms have matured into full-fledged digital sovereign zones, each with its own governance structures, dispute resolution systems, currencies or tokenized economies, education models, security protocols, social norms, cultural identities. Some emphasize privacy and decentralization, becoming havens for dissidents, researchers, and nomads. Others emphasize speed, optimization, and efficiency, attracting corporations, developers, and high-income professionals. Others still lean into entertainment, building immersive virtual societies where millions spend more time than in their physical surroundings. In global affairs, the digital empires become indispensable. A conflict in one country might be resolved by an AI-mediated platform that prevents escalation. A currency collapse might be stabilized by platform-managed wallets. A migration crisis might be mitigated by remote work ecosystems spanning continents. Nation-states try to impose laws, but they quickly learn a limit. You can regulate a company, but you cannot regulate a sovereign ecosystem without breaking the lives of your own citizens. The tension becomes the central geopolitical struggle of the era. State versus platform, borders versus networks, territory versus identity. By the 160 to 200 year mark, the outcome is neither conquest nor collapse. Instead, an uneasy coexistence emerges. Nation-states remain the arbiters of land, resources, and physical security. Digital empires become arbiters of identity, commerce, and virtual space. People live in both simultaneously. They obey the laws of one, but thrive under the rules of another. And geopolitics, once defined by maps, treaties, and armies, adapts to include invisible domains where billions of people live daily lives beyond the reach of geography. Future historians won't say that digital empires replaced nations. They'll say they joined them on the stage. Not as rivals, not as corporations, but as sovereigns without land. The first empires made of code. For most of human history, the far north was a blank space on the map, a domain of ice, silence, and cold that seemed hostile to ambition. Explorers wrote of it as a place that resisted not only settlement, but imagination. Trade routes curved around it. Empires ignored it. The world's story happened elsewhere. But as the climate warms and the old familiar rhythms falter, the neglected places begin to awaken. The North, the vast, frozen crown of the planet, slowly becomes the new frontier. It doesn't happen suddenly. At first, the change is subtle. The ice melts earlier each spring, refreezes later each autumn. The great polar cap thins, the multi-year ice breaks apart. New channels appear where only glaciers once stood. Scientists warn that this is a tragedy, and in many ways they're right. Something ancient is fading. Something irreplaceable is slipping away. But geopolitics rarely obeys nostalgia. Where the ice retreats, shipping arrives, and the world begins to rearrange itself around the possibility of a navigable Arctic. The first ships are cautious, icebreakers supporting cargo vessels through narrow windows in the summer. But with each passing year, the windows widen. What was once a 2-week miracle becomes a months-long corridor. Ports, long considered remote, suddenly sit beside a new shortcut connecting continents. For nations with northern coastlines, this shift is transformative. A northern harbor that once saw a trickle of research vessels now pulses with container traffic. Radar stations, once lonely and windswept, become hubs of strategic monitoring. Naval docks expand. Rail lines creep northward. Entire regions long considered peripheral find themselves thrust into the center of global logistics. Where access grows, competition follows. The Arctic Ocean becomes a theater of subtle choreography, ice-capable ships tracing careful routes, fleets shadowing each other at a polite distance, satellites tracking every movement across shifting ice flows. Nations claim continental shelves rich with minerals and hydrocarbons, once locked beneath permafrost. New treaties are drafted, debated, broken, rewritten. And yet, amid the tensions, cooperation emerges too. Because the Arctic is unforgiving. Its storms are sudden. Its nights are endless. Its ecosystems still fragile even as temperatures rise. Rival nations find themselves forced, often reluctantly, into joint rescue agreements, joint environmental monitoring, joint scientific installations. The North demands not just ambition, but humility. As decades stretch into a century, the far North begins to look less like an empty expanse and more like a constellation of strategic nodes. New cities, carefully engineered, wind-shielded, energy-efficient, rise where none existed. Some are mining towns, others are logistics hubs, others are research centers connected by buried fiber lines and geothermal plants. And as the equatorial regions face growing climate pressures, the North's relative stability becomes a magnet. Populations rise, agriculture experiments with high-latitude crops. Universities and think tanks migrate to cooler climates. Renewable energy grids tap into vast offshore wind and tidal power. By the 130 to 150-year mark, the map looks inverted. The regions once thought peripheral, Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, the Nordic Arctic, Siberia, become the arteries through which global commerce flows. Nations that once measured their power by warm water ports now measure it by ice-capable fleets and northern infrastructure. The term the Great North emerges to describe a coalition of states whose influence rests not on population or ideology, but on geography newly awakened. Their leverage lies in control of Arctic shipping corridors, stewardship of critical climate ecosystems, access to rare mineral deposits under thawing land, dominance of cold weather engineering and adaptation technologies, and the simple, strategic reality that the world now needs the North more than the North needs the world. 2 centuries in, the global order has rewired itself around these northern latitudes. The Arctic Circle, once a distant ring of snow, is now one of the busiest regions on Earth. A mosaic of states and regional coalitions manage it with a mixture of cooperation and rivalry, always aware that the North gives much, but takes much if disrespected. The future of geopolitics is no longer drawn solely along the equator or the temperate zones. It is drawn at the top of the world, where ice meets ambition, where silence meets strategy, where the new map of power has finally caught up to the shifting climate. The Great North is no longer the edge of the world. It is the world. The story of global power has long been told from the perspective of the North. Its capitals, its currencies, its academies, its wars, its shape of the world. But there is an older, quieter truth beneath that narrative. Most of humanity has always lived in the South. And in this future, the center of global influence begins to drift toward that demographic reality. It starts with momentum. Cities in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America swell with youthful populations, millions entering the workforce each year, millions more connected to digital infrastructure for the first time. What were once described as developing regions shed that label through sheer velocity. New tech districts rise in places that, a century earlier, would have been overlooked by global investors. Universities multiply. Industrial parks expand. High-speed internet, cheap, decentralized, and ubiquitous, becomes the backbone of entire economies. The northern world, aging and shrinking in many places, watches the demographic tidal wave gather force. Growth begins to reside elsewhere. Innovation, once centralized in a handful of global cities, spreads across continents once described as margins. And then something deeper shifts. Over the next 40 to 70 years, trade patterns reorganize. African ports modernize, rail corridors stitch together regions long isolated, and manufacturing ecosystems diversify away from their once dominant hubs. Latin America builds new partnerships across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, bypassing historical dependencies. South Asia, long the demographic giant, becomes a constellation of powerful economic nodes, competing fiercely, cooperating where necessary, and slowly, steadily increasing their global footprint. But the Southern rise is not simply economic, it's institutional. After decades of frustration with international bodies built for another era, Southern nations begin forming their own networks, development banks with local priorities, climate alliances that reflect local realities, digital standards shaped by local populations. Not a single bloc, not a monolith, but a concert of nations whose voices once carried little weight at global summits now speak with unified confidence. The concert of the global South emerges gradually, almost organically, not a military alliance, not an ideological union, but a strategic chorus. Countries coordinate votes at international meetings. They negotiate as a group. They decide what they will and won't accept from the dominant power centers of earlier centuries. And the world's balance begins to tilt. Climate policy becomes impossible without Southern nations at the negotiating table, not as recipients of aid, but as architects of new frameworks. Mineral and agricultural supplies, once taken for granted by wealthy importers, are now bargaining chips. Digital markets, hundreds of millions of new consumers each decade, reshape the incentives of global corporations. Cultural influence flows outward, music, film, and storytelling from the South gain massive global audiences. By the 120-year mark, the Southern rise becomes one of the defining forces of the era. GDP growth no longer tracks neatly along old lines. Many of the world's swing economies, countries whose decisions can make or break global agreements, are now in the South. Some possess vast renewable energy zones. Others command critical mineral supplies. Others offer young, adaptable labor forces. Influence converges around those who hold the future's scarcest resources: youth, land, energy, and climate resilience. But the rise is not uniform. Rivalries exist, borders strain. Some governments falter, others surge. The concert is not a utopia, it is a negotiation, constantly evolving, sometimes fractious, always dynamic. Its strength lies not in unity but in plurality. And yet, the North cannot ignore it. Efforts to pressure, isolate, or divide Southern coalitions fail. Aid projects are renegotiated, trade agreements rewritten. In diplomacy, the South no longer asks for a seat at the table. It moves the table. By the 150 to 200-year horizon, the global map looks different, not in the shapes of borders, but in the flow of influence. Capital moves more freely between Lagos, Mumbai, Jakarta, São Paulo, and Nairobi. Global institutions, once tilted toward the perspectives of a few, adapt or fade. New forums rise with Southern leadership at their core. The world becomes less hierarchical, more distributed, more reflective of where humanity actually lives. Future historians describe this transition not as a revolution, but as a correction, a long-postponed rebalancing, a shift back toward demographic center of gravity. And in this new world, the South stands not as a challenger to the North, but as a co-author of the global story, a story that finally feels shared. There is a point where complexity becomes too heavy for large structures to carry. Systems stretch, strain, and then, quietly, split. Not in violence and not in collapse, but in fragmentation, the way old stone breaks along lines that were always there, invisible until the pressure reveals them. In this future, the political map of the world doesn't die. It thins. The nation-state endures, but more as a skin stretched over hundreds of internal worlds. City regions, autonomous zones, corporate territories, climate enclaves, cultural strongholds, and places where local governance becomes more real than the distant capital. The fragmentation begins innocently enough. Megacities grow larger than many nations, their skylines rising like continents of glass and steel. Their economies rival those of entire regions. Their technological ecosystems evolve faster than federal laws can understand. Their identities grow distinct, different rhythms, different problems, different ambitions. At some point, these cities stop waiting for national policy to keep up. They begin to act. A city forms its own climate adaptation plan, ignoring the national one. Another signs trade agreements directly with foreign metros. Another builds a security force larger and better equipped than its country's army. The logic is simple. A metropolis of 30 million has needs that a remote national government cannot, or will not, prioritize. Infrastructure, ports, water, food, energy, all require decisions made at the speed of survival. And once a few cities begin asserting that autonomy, others follow. States don't fall apart in dramatic declarations. They slowly hollow, retaining ceremonial unity while real power flows downward into city-states and upward into networks. By mid-century, fragmentation becomes a pattern. Some parts of nations, wealthy and globally connected, push for special administrative status. Others, neglected, underdeveloped, or culturally distinct, demand self-rule simply to remain functional. Meanwhile, corporations and digital platforms overlay their own jurisdictions across the map, adding yet another layer of semi-sovereign authority. A person's legal life becomes a tangle of memberships. City resident, platform participant, national citizen, regional bloc member. Borders remain on paper, but in practice, The world functions as an archipelago of overlapping sovereignties. Some micro-states thrive, climate-resilient coastal zones, clean energy islands, financial hubs carved out of former industrial districts. Others struggle, cut off from resources they once relied on. Some negotiate loose federations. Others experiment with governance models that blend ancient traditions with high-tech systems. International relations shift accordingly. Summits that once brought together nations now also include representatives from megacities, autonomous regions, and even digital jurisdictions. Treaty language grows labyrinthine as agreements must accommodate entities of radically different scales. Conflicts become more localized. Turf disputes over water, trade choke points, mineral corridors. Diplomacy resembles urban planning on a global scale, negotiating where roads, pipelines, fiber lines, and desalination arcs cross through dozens of semi-independent zones. By the 120 to 160 year mark, the old map and the real map diverge so sharply that cartographers speak of two worlds. The legal map, nation-states still crisply colored, borders intact. The functional map, a mosaic of hundreds of self-directed polities, many unnamed, many informal, all interconnected. Yet the world does not implode. It decentralizes. People find identity in smaller, more immediate communities. Cities innovate faster, regions specialize. Networks thrive. The great machinery of national politics slows, but below it, thousands of smaller engines turn at high speed. By the 180 to 200 year horizon, this archipelago world becomes the new normal. Not a world of chaos, but a world where power is distributed, where the scale of politics matches the scale of daily life, where governance is shaped by proximity rather than geography alone. Nations still exist. Flags still wave. But the true architecture of civilization is built from hundreds of interconnected islands of sovereignty, a world that no longer resembles a map, but a constellation. The future, once imagined as monolithic blocks, now unfolds in shimmering fragments, each one alive, ambitious, and responsible for its own piece of the human story. For centuries, space was a direction rather than a destination, a black ocean we pointed rockets toward, but never truly entered. A symbol more than a sphere of influence. But the future has a way of turning symbols into infrastructure. What begins as modest satellite clusters and lunar research habitats slowly expands into something larger, a new geographic layer of human activity, perched not on land or sea but on the thin margins between Earth and the endless dark. And as soon as humans build in space, space becomes political. The transition happens gradually, almost reluctantly. At first, orbital stations are extensions of Earth, floating labs, communication hubs, manufacturing modules producing exotic materials that can only form in microgravity. A few astronauts rotate through them, flags on their arms, mission patches on their jackets. But the economic logic changes as orbital manufacturing matures. Components for quantum computers, ultra-clean biotech, rare crystalline alloys, these things grow easier and cheaper above Earth than on it. And where value forms, power follows. By mid-century, space becomes a dense neighborhood. Satellites, stations, robotic mining barges, solar farms, and observation arrays circling Earth in delicate choreography. Launches happen daily, not yearly. Orbital paths become congested. Commerce networks grow thick around the planet. For the first time, Earth must negotiate with itself in 3 dimensions. Nations build orbital zones of influence. clusters of infrastructure that drift across the sky like slow-moving fleets. Treaties attempt to regulate proximity, ownership, salvage rights, and the still uncomfortable question of what it means to own an orbit. And then humanity pushes outward. Lunar infrastructure evolves from research stations into industry nodes, robotic miners digging into regolith for helium-3, rare minerals, and manufacturing materials. Cislunar space becomes a web of transit points, fuel depots, and relay hubs. Autonomous craft hop between orbits the way aircraft hop between airports. Earthbound politics begins to shift. A nation with lunar factories can negotiate trade from a position of strength. A coalition that controls the majority of Earth's solar power satellites can influence global energy markets. Even access to high-value orbital manufacturing becomes leverage. To deny a rival access to orbital logistics is to halt their industries back on Earth. In this future, power is no longer measured only in tanks, currencies, land size, or population. It is measured in launch capabilities, control over orbital slots, access to microgravity manufacturing, cislunar logistics, asteroid mining rights, and the ability to threaten or protect space infrastructure. The result is a new kind of deterrence, one not built on destruction, but on dependency. The world learns that interfering with another nation's orbital infrastructure risks collapse far beyond the battlefield, economic devastation, communication outages, climate monitoring blindness. So nations draw invisible lines across the sky. They shadow each other's satellites. They debate acceptable distance in orbit with the same seriousness once reserved for disputed rivers or coastlines. And something even stranger begins to take shape. The off-world settlements, rotating habitats, lunar industry towns, asteroid mining consortia start developing their own identity. Their population is small but cohesive. Their needs differ from Earth's. Their rhythms follow orbital cycles, not political calendars. They are still legally tied to terrestrial nations, but culturally, they float somewhere between Earth and independence. By the 120 to 160 year mark, these off-world communities interact with Earth more as partners than colonies. They bargain for trade rights, negotiate for resource access, demand environmental protections for their fragile structures. Some Earth nations listen, others resist. None can ignore them. And geopolitics evolves again. Instead of a world divided by land and sea, humans now live across three environments: earthbound nations, orbital settlements, lunar and deep space industrial nodes, each with its own interests, each with its own vulnerabilities, each capable of influencing the others. By the 200-year horizon, the space frontier is no longer frontier. It is home to a new class of geopolitical actors, smaller in number but not in leverage. Their power is subtle, distributed, and technological. Their existence forces Earth to accept a truth once reserved for science fiction. The power is no longer exclusively terrestrial. The map of the future includes not only continents and oceans, but orbits, transfer points, resource nodes, and fragile habitats clinging to the edges of gravity. And in that new map, the sky is no longer empty. It is contested, negotiated, and desperately needed. The space frontier has arrived, and Earth now shares the stage. There is a quiet shift that begins not with rebellion or crisis, but with exhaustion. Exhaustion from complexity, from problems too tangled for committees, from decisions too vast for any single mind. And into that exhaustion steps something new. Not a ruler, not a revolution, but an algorithm. At first it's unimposing, a tool, a helper, a system designed to simulate the economic outcome of a proposed policy. A forecasting engine to anticipate climate impacts. A crime prevention model predicting trouble before it surfaces. A budget optimizer scanning millions of variables and revealing paths no human analyst could ever compute. Governments adopt these systems because they must. The world has become too fast, too interconnected, too fragile to govern by instinct alone. And slowly, very slowly, algorithmic guidance shifts from advisory to essential. Over time, citizens grow accustomed to "the model recommends" as a phrase spoken in city halls and parliaments. The algorithms reduce traffic, stabilize energy grids, anticipate pandemics, and optimize water allocation. They do not rule, but they become the architecture behind every decision. The transition is subtle, barely noticed at first. But decades later, something profound has changed. Countries now differ based on how deeply they trust their algorithms. Some become pioneers of the algorithmic order. They integrate machine-guided planning into nearly every sector. Urban development, health distribution, agriculture, taxation, resource flows, emergency response. Their cities hum, their logistics pulse with efficiency. Their budgets stretch further than expected. Citizens of these states value the stability, the predictability, the calm. The traffic jams that once defined their lives fade. Food shortages become rare. Blackouts vanish. Waste shrinks. In these societies, the algorithm is not a dictator. It is a shepherd guiding millions of decisions each day with mathematical precision. But other nations hesitate. They see the risks. They worry about transparency, about dependence, about the values embedded in code written by unseen engineers, about how optimization can clash with human nuance. And this divide, algorithmic versus non-algorithmic, slowly reshapes global alliances. Algorithmic states coordinate astonishingly fast. Their policy AIs exchange climate data, economic forecasts, logistical flows with seamless integration. Regions governed by machine-optimized systems begin syncing like interconnected organisms. Meanwhile, nations without these systems struggle to keep pace, either resisting or reluctantly plugging into someone else's architecture. The geopolitical consequence is striking. Whoever controls the dominant algorithms controls the gravitational pull of global governance, not through coercion, but through usefulness. The third world of this era is not defined by poverty, but by data scarcity. Nations lacking clean, rich data sets cannot train competitive models. Their predictions lag. Their systems strain. And every year the gap widens. A global question forms. Are we building a world run by models we can't fully understand? By year 120, the algorithmic order is no longer a trend. It is the backbone of global coordination. Weather modeling systems manage transcontinental water sharing. AI-guided logistics prevent famine by rerouting supplies before shortages begin. Public health systems anticipate surges months in advance. Cross-border carbon allocation is balanced by models optimizing the planetary budget. Politics still exists. But politics now debates goals, while the algorithms determine the pathways. By 160 to 200 years, several algorithmic blocks emerge, each defined not by culture or ideology, but by the architecture of their policy engines. Some prioritize environmental resilience. Some prioritize economic growth, some prioritize social cohesion. Each has strengths, each has shadows. But the most profound shift is personal. A citizen in this era grows up with a different relationship to governance, not through loyalty to a state, but through trust in a system that seems omnipresent yet invisible. Their traffic route is optimized. Their energy usage is balanced. Their medical care is pre-scheduled. Their taxes are auto-calculated. Their city breathes with them. The algorithmic order is not tyranny nor utopia. It is a negotiation, a constant tug-of-war between human intention and machine optimization. And the great geopolitical dilemma of this era becomes, who shapes the algorithms that shape the world? And what happens when human politics and machine logic disagree? The future answers these questions not with certainty, but with tension. A delicate coexistence of human values and machine intelligence, the two guiding civilization together through a world too complex for either to navigate alone. The final future is not a single timeline, but a pair of possibilities. Two long corridors stretching out from the present, both plausible, both fragile, both shaped by millions of choices made quietly across decades. One leads toward continuity, the other toward strain, both toward transformation. This is the story of the long peace, or the long emergency. The long peace. The long peace begins not with triumph, but with restraint. As weapons grow devastating and economies grow intertwined, nations learn, slowly, painfully, that no great power war can be won in any meaningful sense. Conflicts simmer, yes. Cyber attacks flare. Propaganda sweeps across networks. Drones shadow borders. But the big wars, the ones that used to redraw continents, remain unthinkable. Fear becomes wisdom. Wisdom becomes habit. Habit becomes stability. Over the next century, major powers develop a strange choreography, a ritual of competition bounded by unspoken rules. They push, pull, threaten, posture, but rarely cross the fatal line. Crises erupt and fade like storms, leaving bruises but not scars. Meanwhile, global institutions, some new, some old, quietly adapt. Pandemics are met with coordinated response fleets. Climate disasters are cushioned by shared adaptation reserves. Migration waves are managed, not ignored. Supply chains are distributed enough to prevent collapse. The world doesn't solve its problems perfectly, or even elegantly, but it solves them enough. In this future, the great miracle is not utopia. It is survival with dignity. Countries grow, falter, rebuild. Regions compete, cooperate, hesitate. But the brittle, breakable world of the early 21st century transitions into something sturdier. 200 years in, historians describe the era as one of managed tension. A world where conflicts stay cold, where crises stay local, where the superpowers grow cautious, not reckless, where human civilization avoids the cliff long enough to build bridges across it. Peace, in this timeline, is not the absence of struggle. It is the mastery of it. The long emergency. But there is another future, a quieter, heavier one. The long emergency begins with overlap dash dash, crises stacking atop one another faster than institutions can absorb. A drought, hitting during a recession. A heat wave during a migration surge. A technological disruption during political instability. A pandemic during resource shortages. No single event destroys the system. It's the layering that does it. Governments grow reactive rather than proactive. Trust in institutions erodes. Regions turn inward. Borders tighten. International cooperation becomes sporadic, transactional, contingent. Climate change accelerates, reshaping coastlines and food systems. Cities experience rolling blackouts and water rationing. Economic shocks ripple unpredictably. People learn to live with a constant undertone of instability. It is not collapse, it is drift. A slow, grinding tension that becomes the background noise of daily life. By century's end, the world remains recognizable, but thinner, harder, more brittle. Some nations adapt well, others fragment. Some regions thrive behind fortified infrastructure. Others struggle with permanent scarcity. The global stage becomes a patchwork of emergencies, resource disputes here, climate-displaced populations there, financial crises flickering like brush fires. 2 centuries into the long emergency, historians describe the era as a slow descent into improvisation. Not a fall, but a forgetting. A gradual unraveling of global coordination thread by thread. Civilization survives, but it is tired. The uncertain middle. Most futures don't choose a side, and neither does this one. The real future, if history is any guide, will be a shifting braid of both timelines. Years of stability, followed by years of strain. Moments of collective brilliance, followed by moments of deep fracture. Progress in one region, hardship in another. The long peace and the long emergency are not opposites. They are conditions that alternate, each shaping the foundations of the other. Humanity will move forward through turbulence and triumph, through frictions and breakthroughs, through ingenuity and error. And the world that emerges 2 centuries from now will carry the imprint of both paths. The peace we managed to preserve and the emergencies we failed to prevent. The future will not be calm, but it will be ours. Built decision by decision, generation by generation, era by era. Not destiny, direction, not prophecy, possibility. The long peace, or the long emergency, or something forever in between.